I'm delighted to introduce you to our plenary speaker, Dr. Rachel Elizabeth Weissler. Dr. Rachel Elizabeth Weissler is a faculty member in the Psychology, Linguistics, and Black Studies at the University of Oregon. Her research program centers ratio-linguistic emotional perception and production. She is an African-American English scholar using experimental methods with sociolinguistic and psycholinguistics to understand how stereotypes influence how people are perceived based on how they speak. She is a co-director of the Umoja Black Scholars Academic Residential Community and a co-director of the Black Strategic Group for faculty and staff at the University of Oregon as well. She engages with public scholarship, sharing her expertise with venues such as the New York Times, Vice, PBS, and more. And I've shared a link for further information about the doctor's impact as well in the chat. In addition, she is an avid mentor and advisor for the Institute for Recruitment of Teachers. She is passionate about translating science into practice to improve outcomes for minoritized populations. So with no further ado, Dr. Weissler, you're up.
Hi, thank you so much. We can hear me all right, I hope. Let me know in the chat if you can't. Great, awesome, thanks. I'm gonna go ahead and share a portion of my screen. I wanna make sure I can have the chat open in case I see any questions that come up. But thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you all today. I am going to be talking about, as my title suggests, linguistic justice and Black innovation. To get started, though, I wanted to quickly discuss the places on the University of Oregon's campus that I occupy. So I am a linguist. I got my PhD in linguistics at the University of Michigan, and I work at the University of Oregon in linguistics, but I also work in Indigenous race and ethnic studies, under which Black studies is a field. We are not a department yet at the University of Oregon. And I'm also working directly with Black Strategies Group as well as the Umoja Black Scholars. That is to say that whether it's Black faculty, staff, or students, I'm working pretty centrally with directing how our communities in Oregon can feel connected with one another. And one of the big ways that one of the things that ties us all together is language and the innovative nature of Black language in the United States. And so I'll be happy to talk about this more, but I wanted to at least give a little bit of an understanding of sort of what my positionality is at the University of Oregon. You know, within linguistics, before I was there, there weren't people there talking about different Englishes that exist in the world, when we of course know that there are many different ways to speak English. In our classrooms, we definitely come into contact with students all over the world, right, that speak Englishes in all of these different ways, whether you're an English language learner or you are speaking a variety of English. That's not the mainstream variety in whatever place in which you live. So we don't often think about, or we probably do, but others outside of English language learning spaces might not necessarily think about the important impact of language as it relates to culture and connection. And I've really been enjoying my role so far, getting to integrate that within students, faculty, and staff at the U of O. So I wanted to first start with, what do I mean when I say linguistic justice and Black innovation? So when I talk about linguistic justice, what I'm speaking to specifically is having a goal for all people, all speakers, to be treated equally and educated equally. When I describe Black innovation, I'm talking specifically about how Black people globally are often the ones that are at the forefront of linguistic change, and we have plenty of research to show this, but then often that can result in us being at the disposal of appropriation, whether that's linguistic or appropriation in other ways, the ways in which we wear our hair, the ways in which we are engaged with our communities. And so I'm really hopeful by the end of this talk, we can think about how can we as Black English language professionals incorporate our knowledges of linguistic justice and Black innovation to thus result in how we treat our students. But that leads me to like an initial question, which is, why have we historically been focused in education on white heteronormative spoken populations in language? And what I often like to tell my students is that most of education is focused on what we call weird and wispy speakers. Now, what do I mean by weird and wispy? So weird, if we haven't seen this acronym before, and I've definitely shared this whenever I talk about what language varieties are focused on. We are focused on languages that are Western, that are educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. But when we think about the speakers, we're often focused on languages that are written, languages that are institutionally supported, languages that are standardized, and languages that have prestige. And then if we think about that why as well, we can, that's just to make it sound like the cute acronym. So with that in mind, we can see how having some, what happens in our classrooms when we're engaged with students that are not necessarily aligning with this. And I'll move on. So this might make us then consider in our classrooms when we're telling our students how to work with different language varieties, what necessarily makes somebody a good speaker. And again, as a linguist and as a language scientist, I'm here to tell you that there's no way to measure what makes someone good or bad. When we care about language, we care about mutual intelligibility. So that means if I understand you and you understand me, we've accomplished the communicative mission. And so there's no way to actually measure good. But when we're thinking about maybe how we might consider good, again, we're thinking about mutual intelligibility and following Grice's maxims. So that has to do with the quality with which we're speaking. So being truthful, not giving false or unsupported information, the quantity, so making sure we're saying enough information but not giving too much, relation, so making sure that we're staying relevant to the topic of discussion, and then manner, so making sure that we are clear, brief, and orderly, and avoiding obscurity and ambiguity. So these are things that any speaker of any of the 7,000 languages of the world might want to align with. But why does it matter to think about someone being a good or bad speaker? I will argue that one of the biggest issues that we have in English language learning is that when we're looking at people doing English language learning differently, sometimes these differences that we see can enact discrimination. So I often talk about how when we consider categorical discrimination, it is a survival skill that's necessary for us as humans, right? So I often give this example with these signs. So if we're driving, we need to be able to discern what the yield sign is versus the stop sign versus the do not enter so that we're not bumping into people on the road, right? So as humans, we necessarily need this discriminatory ability. However, this discriminatory ability can also lead us to particular ways of enacting discrimination if we're making associations about somebody's identity and how that influences how we feel that they are speaking and talking. So for example, I always give this example of these two Winnie the Poohs, one with the red shirt and one with the more professional outfit on. And even though these words are written the same, caramel versus caramel, and you can think on the other side which one you think is associated with which speaker. We often might say, well, this person on the bottom is fancy, so we'll say caramel, and I'll say, but why? And that makes us, again, think about why do we associate certain speech sounds with certain ways in which people will speak? So why are we associating fanciness, let's say, with multiple syllables in this word versus caramel, which is maybe seen as less fancy? There's nothing inherent about the speech sounds that are resulting in how people speak differently and anything about their identity. But again, as social human beings, we make relationships between how people sound and who they are. I'm going to give a quick detour thinking about how, again, we see just as we're thinking about the Winnie the Pooh example, we see two basketball stars here. Both are making the exact same action with their hand in front of their face. However, when we look at how these women were described online, we see completely different adjectives, completely different linguistic markers that are used to describe what the Black girl is being perceived as versus this white girl, correct? So we see the ghetto, unprofessional versus queen, competitive, and so on. Some more examples of this, as I said prior, the race of an athlete. The race of an athlete selects a word, it gets used to describe them, right? And so this is a form of racialization and semantic intensity. So again, Serena is a pretty good example of this when we think about, unstoppable, a beast, and then suddenly insatiable, ferocious, violent. Again, all of these ways in which we are using linguistic features to describe certain people and using this racialization and racially coded terminology. And so with that, I want us to keep that in mind as we go into thinking about indexicality, which I believe is on the next slide. So indexical meaning and discrimination, there we go. So when I'm discussing, right, how we are thinking about a certain person with certain attributes and then making these associations about them and how they will speak, this is called indexical meaning, which some of us may know about. So social meanings, this has to do with social meanings that are associated with a particular linguistic form. The capacity of an element of the language structure of an entire accent or dialect or a part of the language to evoke social meaning. So for example, when we think about, let's take it out of the language context and give me one moment. I'm sorry, working from home, give me one moment. Sorry about that. Thank you for your patience. So if I'm thinking about something like smoke, if we saw smoke on the other side of the building, for example, you're only seeing smoke. You might say, oh my gosh, there's a fire, we need to leave. But if we think about the fact of the matter, right, you didn't see any fire. All that you saw was smoke, which indexed that there was fire. But smoke could mean many other things, correct? But we make assumptions based on what we see, and then we index that to mean something else. So similarly, we might say if we hear someone call someone dude, we might not only think that they're talking about a man, or actually it's a pretty gender neutral term at this point in English, right? But it also can be a word that indicates camaraderie, meaning that you're a friend or that we have a casual relationship. So again, there's much social meaning that is indexed within the terms that we use beyond just the definition of what those words mean. But there's also something called indexical fields. So terms can have more than one meaning. So we can think of an indexical field as a cloud of composed stances, personality types, and permanent qualities rather than a single fixed meaning. And I'd be happy to give you many examples of this, but perhaps you can think of some on your own. And I will go ahead and move it on. Thanks so much for the affirmations in the chat there. So I might take a step over to animation for a moment to think about how animation and Blackness relates to indexicality. So the use of language in the media can be used to build a character, right? And it relies on associations between these linguistic forms and their social meanings. And this helps viewers build and maintain associations between varieties and assumptions about certain types of people who speak those varieties. But that also can be to our detriment, right? If we only understand Black people, how we are seeing them being represented on TV or in cartoons, how is that going to impact the way that we're interacting with Black people in real life and Black people that are speaking perhaps aligned with or not aligned with the ways that they are portrayed? And this can go a bunch of different ways. One of my saddest, but I think important examples is seeing whether or not a Black woman, and again, as mentioned earlier, I study Black women and emotion perception because Black women often get perceived as angry when we're not being actually angry, having to do with the angry Black woman trope and so on. But for example, if a Black woman doesn't align with the speech patterns with which she is stereotyped as, she might be seen as inauthentic and untruthful and not aligning with, because she's not aligning with a stereotype. But then if she does align with these particular stereotypes, then she gets discriminated against. So that's a big open question in my research program of how can a Black woman represent herself linguistically in the public sphere without being tormented, treated differently, and her English or her any language that she's speaking be listened to as credible and authentic. Moving forward, so when we think about how do we learn to discriminate linguistically, and I think this is important, not just in this frame of thinking about TV and animation, but also considering how we're interacting with children in the English language learning classrooms, we have to think about this path in which an ideology can result in naturalization and then perpetuation. So again, ideologies, indexical features. So we have an idea about a person, let's say they're a Black woman, and now we're going to make all of these assumptions about the way in which they speak. And then what can happen is often, let's say we're looking at a film, for example, children's films play a role in naturalizing these ideologies because children learn to interpret this linguistic variation. So they make ideologies or these beliefs seem like norms or common sense instead of being an ideology that is being pushed forward. And then, of course, that results in perpetuation. So systematically reinforcing these ideologies that have already been naturalized. So now we might just believe that this is just how Black women are, this is just how Black women speak, without actually being able to interrogate what's actually going on within the speech signal. Some of my research that I don't discuss today actually looks at what's actually going on in the speech signal of Black women. Again, that's my example because this is a population that I care most about. And so I record Black women, I look at the physical instantiations of sound, I look at the intensity of the voice, the volume, all these different aspects of the physical instantiation of sound. And then I have participants listen to them, right? And oftentimes there's assumptions made about the speech that aren't actually within the speech stream themselves. This is one way I think as a linguist and as linguists in general, we can help with linguistic justice, right? Social justice by using the tools that we have at our scientific disposal to dispel these sorts of myths. Again, what do we learn from the indexicality that shows up in our media and thus and then in real life? The association of linguistic variability includes these range of social factors. So I've talked a bit about race and gender, but of course, age is definitely a factor, social class, regional affiliation, that's a big one, especially in the United States, and I'm sure globally as well. But importantly, and kind of fearfully was the word that came to mind, but we think about character motivation within film. So how does the person that we're thinking about associating with that language then aligning with that type of person's morality, dominance and subordination, intelligence, heroism, etc. So if you think about Disney and who are the characters that are the bad guys and what kind of language varieties are they speaking, they usually sound like English not as a first language speakers, or they sound like Black speakers. The ones that come to mind are the bad guy in Aladdin, and then also often Black voices are used for comic relief as well. So like in Mulan, the little dragon, right? And that's Eddie Murphy, I believe. But then children are thus then socialized to associate particular ways of speaking with particular types of people. So in these English language learning contexts, if we're using these tools or these films to show children the different, like how to speak English and English in these different ways, and then we have English varieties looking different, but associated with certain characters with certain motivations, how is that going to influence how we're going to be viewing again, particular types of people beyond what they're witnessing on TV and in film. So pulling back out a little bit, when I think about my work and I think about my goals, which are broadly a socio-cognitive linguistic analysis for social justice, and that's a big way of saying I care about the social aspects and I care about how our brains are processing, right? So how, when I come into contact with you, what is my brain doing that is allowing me to make particular judgments? And how can I use that for social justice? So one of the recent articles that I've written with some colleagues have talked about tapping into people's percepts concerning foreignness and difference, which can be gleaned from speaker behavior. We can also use neurophysiological and visual processing tools to look at variability with respect to indexicality. So again, those are things to say, you know, what if we have the identical sentences, everything is the same except the speakers? Or if everything is the same and all we do is tell participants, one group that you're listening to one type of person and then tell another group you're listening to another type of person, when in fact you're listening to all the same audio, is it powerful enough to give that kind of information to thus result in different neurophysiological activity, which my prior research tells us that yes, you can tell participants something and they'll say that they hear something that's not actually in the acoustic stream itself. And then of course, as a researcher, I care about replicability and accessibility of tools that are used in measurement, but I won't focus on that in this talk. You're welcome to talk to me about it later if you're interested. I want to shift a little bit. I've been talking a lot about research and theory and indexicality, but you know, as a professor, I'm also a teacher, and teaching is actually one of my favorite parts of my job. And so thinking about teaching with linguistics justice being centered, I'll say that one of my biggest courses at the University of Oregon is a course called Language and Power. And I love this course for a lot of reasons, but the biggest thing I love about the course is that it's predominantly non-linguistics majors. So I get the opportunity to have students come in from all over the country, all over the world, and I get to kind of blow their minds around these issues of mutual intelligibility and English variability and so on. I've also taught courses such as Perspectives on Linguistic Perception, Gender and Languages in Minoritized Communities. I taught a course called Tomato Tomato, again, language variability there. And then of course I teach the Umoja Black Scholars in the academic residential community. One thing I really like about this course, and I'm talking a little meta now here about pedagogy, is I like to use multiple modalities for the content to engage with. So that means that at the end of my course, I usually don't have a final exam. I usually don't have something that I require students to memorize just for the sake of this course. Again, when I have these students, I have about 150 students in my big lecture, and I don't expect everyone to become a linguistics major, though that would be so cool. But what I really want them to do is use the linguistic lens that I've brought to them in the course and allow that to be what they end up using to work with whatever their major is. So whether that's the medical field, whether that's, let's say, chemistry, let's say, I could go on and on, the political science, anything like this. And so because of that, why would I give them a test for something to memorize rather than giving them a tool and a different modality that could actually benefit them in the future? So on the right column, you can see on the screen, I have different final project formats for students that I've been so lucky to see happen. And I always tell students, you can submit, and I would love to have 14 more. I would love to have 100 more, right? But so some students, decide, I actually want to write a research paper, and that's great. I will review a research paper and I will be happy to. Some students want to engage in a video essay, where they want to make posters or do interviews or do drawings, lean into their creative side, like a political drawing and so on. Some students have made linocut protest posters, they've made websites, they've done interviews, they've done posters for K through 12 classrooms, and definitely great for English language learning teachers, poems, campaign posters, lesson plans and curriculum, informational digital slides, which often come in the form of like Instagram slides, which are a really good way of getting and translating science to the public, audio essays. There are some examples. I'm not going to play them all here for sake of time, but this is an example of an informational video that a student made. I also had an example project of Instagram slides where a student was deconstructing this term. Also had a website where the student was able to talk about protecting and supporting language variety and diversity. And again, some really great things that these students end up bringing from their own minds. And again, we all speak language and we have an invested interest because of that. And allowing students to lean into their own strengths not only allows them to do projects like this that will benefit them, maybe in the long run beyond the classroom, but beyond the class, but I also think it allows them to be empowered in the language variety that they speak and the English variety that they speak as well. This is an example of a lesson plan from a student. The lesson topic was implications of language. And again, they did a really great job incorporating tools that we had learned in the class around linguistic diversity and variability. This is another example of some Instagram slides. These are from a couple of years ago, but I really loved them. They have to do with some nuance around hardships in the pandemic with ASL. So some of us, when we think about language, we might only think about spoken language, but of course, language is also used not only with the language and mouth modality, but also with hand modality. And some people were talking about during the pandemic when we all had to have our mouths covered, when people are signing, they use their face as well as their hands. And so how do we maintain communication with this barrier for the deaf community? And so the student talked about how this tool called the Clear Mask came out, which was something where students could actually, or people could actually see the mouth, which allows them to do mouthing alongside their hand movement, and then some of the pushback that came from that. And so, yeah, just some really interesting but simplified information brought to me from a student, and just a really great way to get students thinking more broadly about language diversity. So something else I'd want to talk about are interventions for accessibility and transparency in education and research. So I'll start with one of the papers that came out this year called Examining Linguistic and Experimenter Bias Through Native versus Non-Native Speech. Now, this is an interesting paper. I already talked to you a little bit about its findings. So for example, rather than putting the burden on the speaker, putting the burden on the listener and making sure that the listeners can, that might be unfamiliar with a certain language variety or a certain English variety, can then familiarize themselves rather than being putting people into binary categories of native and non-native, which often excludes the perceived non-native individual and also puts the burden on them to learn the norms of the communities with which they're in, rather than broadening the community's knowledge of the different varieties and Englishes. But I wanted to talk beyond the content of this paper. I wanted to talk about the journal in general. Something that I liked about this journal is that they required every author to include a positionality statement. And I'm not sure within other fields where this has been common practice before, but something I really valued about a positionality statement is that it allows the readers to see who is the one that is giving us this information, what are their backgrounds and where are they coming from, and not only like what is their educational background, but their any other identity factors, right? And so as we can see from this paper, this was a paper that was written by a bunch of us, and we ranged in education level from postdoctoral fellows to graduate students, undergraduate students, and faculty. And we all came from a diverse linguistic, socioeconomic, and racial background and have diverse experiences that impact our lives and perspectives and biases and research interests. And you could read more at this link. But again, I think that if more journals on the research and education side could incorporate things like this would allow us to feel more connected to who is actually doing the science and what are the vested interests of those researchers. Something else from a different journal that I appreciated. So this is a paper called The Meaning of the Minds, Broad Horizons in the Study of Linguistic Discrimination through Social Justice with Sociolinguistic and Psycholinguistic Approaches, a mouthful, but aligned with the things that I've been describing to you earlier, not only about the social, but about how our brains are functioning when we're coming and interact with difference. But again, this journal, something I really appreciated about them is that in addition to requiring an abstract, so that's right, a truncated summary of what the paper is about, they said you can give us an abstract that is in academic language, but then you can also give us an abstract in any language variety of your choosing, which is really cool and again, accessible. So you don't need to read this again. This is just the summary that I had for this paper that I wrote. But then when you look at the examples of multiple second abstracts from people, we could see that people had them in different orthographies or written forms. People had like this, for example, an abstract in African American English as this professor named Anne would use it in teaching or class or giving a talk. So a very specified form of a variety of English. Also in different languages from Africa. So this is Isiclosa in Spanish as well. This was the abstract that I ended up doing. And so I ended up doing my abstract for family and friends. Again, one of my biggest passions is about access and translating science so that people understand. And so I made my second abstract in less academic language. My hope with these sorts of things is that by having journals being more aware of who the research is actually impacting, that we can have things like abstracts that are more accessible to our populations, that we can actually drive linguistic justice with that. So I leave us with this final question, and I can then open up for questions. As Black English language professionals, how can we incorporate our knowledge of Black innovation and linguistic justice in our classrooms and pedagogy more broadly? I think I've given already a couple examples of how I've done this and how it's greatly impacted my students. A lot of students come to me after classes talking about how they feel really seen and understood, and they always just perceive the way that they spoke or their family spoke was wrong because nobody told them that it's just difference, not deficit, for example. And so my hope is to hear from all of you as we close this incredible symposium for today, thinking about how we can incorporate these knowledges from what we've learned in our classrooms and pedagogy. So again, I wanted to thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I really enjoy getting to work with BELPAF, and you can get in touch with me at my email here. I also have a Twitter handle in the middle, and then my website is myfullname.com. I'm happy to open it up, and thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Weissler, for such a thought-provoking presentation, which brought together so much of what was said here today at the symposium. We truly appreciate your scholarship and your time. So in the interest of your time, we'll take 2 questions. Anybody have any questions? see some statements, but any questions in particular on the scholarship and information that was presented today? Yes, I see
Yes.
Kai. Go ahead, unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Weissler. I was really struck with your information about how embedded these stereotypes are and the way they're naturalized. And I'm wondering, given that a lot of materials, cultural materials, are being created by, in our capitalist economy, by major corporations, and I'm wondering if you can speak to that dynamic, right? How to work with that. I personally don't have a lot of personal experience with how cultural materials get made through that system, but that's what's impacting popular culture that gets a lot of voice. And I'm wondering what are the pressures to portray, because you did mention, how Black voices are used in a certain way, and of course I was already aware of that, but how can we work with a system when so much of it is more than just like individual creators, but a whole kind of capitalist structure?
The biggest question, a really important one though. So I mean, I feel two ways about, I'll start over here and then come over here. I feel a couple of ways about the academic sphere, because it is so insular. However, something like I was saying, positionality statements, of course, it's good to know who's doing what, but then it also illuminates who is in the background. Like you're talking about, oftentimes when we're thinking about who are the creators, who is in the background making this, we don't actually know. So I always like to think about Apu, for example, from The Simpsons. That person was voiced by a white man, and many people don't know that, right? So that wasn't brought to the forefront. So if we could perhaps be more, and these corporations don't want to be forthcoming and at the forefront of who is being represented and who is representing who, because of this kind of backlash. And so I could be hopeful to say that in the more public sphere, being more forthcoming with who is on the background could illuminate that for people. But yeah, it's something to keep thinking about. I mean, this is why I do appreciate, right, that we have like when we have Black History Month, for example, you'll have like Hulu showcasing Black creators and Black films and all things like this. So at least, we're having certain times of the year with which we're illuminating who is in the background. But it's a bigger overhaul that is going to take time to become more equitable in those spaces, I'd say.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay.
I see a question in the chat that's a really great and important one.
It's at the end of the statement. Okay, go ahead. This one's for
Sorry.
Quenisha. Quenisha, you want to go ahead and ask your question? You can unmute yourself.
Hi, all righty. It's been such a long day. I can ask my question live. Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Weissler, for being here. So my question is, what recommendations do you have for educators who wish to teach Black linguistics outside of the US, particularly within contexts where Black people are underrepresented? This is such a challenging thing because usually when we are abroad, we're probably the only Black person they've ever run into, or the only Black person who's been their English teacher. So we have to be careful and cognizant of who we are consistently, right? So considering we are in an international setting, working with global educators who may have an interest in teaching about African-American vernacular English, the protection of Black women especially, what sorts of recommendations, lesson plans, or ideas or strategies would you recommend?
Yes, big and important questions. I'll have an anecdote to say that I was contacted by a student in Australia out of nowhere earlier this year, telling me that she was doing a class project on African-American English, and she found my name and wanted to interview me. And I did it and was very happy to, but also, again, surprised, like someone so far away has these questions about African-American English. It is a very globally known variety, whether it's because of media and so on. The last time that I talked with BELPAF, I recommended Black language syllabus. And so I can go ahead and get that website. Sorry, Black language syllabus. But that's one place with which actually has some pedagogical tools for people to bring into the classroom. Again, I'll acknowledge and admit that I am an American English's researcher, and so I have limited knowledge about global English varieties within Blackness, but I think that the tools that April Baker Bell has provided on that website is incredible and can just be the start. There are also the Black Language Podcast, which is freely available, I believe, on Spotify and so on. And then Vocal Fry's podcast as well. That's available freely. And that's not specifically about Black language only, but linguistic discrimination more broadly. So these are different tools that people can use to educate themselves with or use as a basis of their lesson plans, I would say. And I guess I could also say, PBS Other Words, I talked with them about what people get wrong about African American English. And so that's a good primer. So if you looked up PBS Other Words in my name, that it should come up on YouTube. But yeah, these are some pieces, but you bring up a crucial point here. And I appreciate it. And I think, being able to talk in spaces like this, I feel really lucky to be connected with BELPAF, for example, because these are the sorts of tools that people in this space want to hear and incorporate. I think in the linguistic space, it can be sort of challenging sometimes to get the buy-in and the importance of this when we're talking about linguistic justice, especially because African American English is the most studied minoritized variety of English. And so many might think, okay, why do we need to keep talking about it? But we're clearly witnessing the necessity for it. So thank you for asking that.
So I see Jody has a question, but we were only going to limit it to 2. So Jody, make it really quick so that the doctor can go about her day.
I apologize. I just, because I've never really been engaged in this type of dialogue before. What is just a book that you would recommend just to learn more? Just what?
There's so many books. I'm going to be really unhelpful right now, but I'll tell you, Lisa Green, she's one of the original African-American English scholars. And so if you looked up Lisa Green linguist, she has 10 books. Shifting is a book about the double lives of Black women in America. It's an incredible book. Oh gosh, Speaking and Sermonizing, that's another great book. Articulate While Black, another one. Yeah, I feel like I could go on and on. Email me and I will tell you plenty more, but hopefully that's a couple there. That's helpful.
All right. Thank you so much.
And I just want to, sorry, Lavette, I just want to point out also something I put in a chat. It's very important that we seek out Black scholars and invite them into the classroom. We now live in a digital age where everyone is connected either on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Many people have access to these different resources. And, when we were at the height of the pandemic, people were reaching out and staying connected on critical issues. So, who's to say you probably reach out to someone and say, hey, I'm teaching a course on Black language. How would you like to attend my classroom? You can bring them into your classroom, even if you're on the other side of the world, and just give students a chance to meet with someone they probably wouldn't meet. So that would probably change their life forever. You never know. So that's it. Thank you.
Yes, that's very a great important point that you're making, because they can add some authenticity, especially if that teacher is not really versed, right? Thank you. Okay, so thank you again. And as the BELPAF co-chair, Lavette Coney, and on behalf of the BELPAF Symposium Committee, we'd like to thank the TESOL International Association's leadership for continuously supporting this symposium, especially in the use of this Zoom platform for the symposium. I just want to give full disclosure that it has been me, Lavette Coney, speaking for myself and for BELPAF under TESOL's platform that they've provided today. So we want to especially thank Nancy Flores for her preliminary work with us, and thank the Symposium Planning Committee, Dr. Quenisha Charles as the principal organizer, and Tamika Robinson, BELPAF chair, co-chair with myself for her numerous contributions. TESOL International Association Executive Director Amber Crowell Kelleher has stayed with us for her support since 7 o'clock this morning until now. She's still on the call. I want to thank her for her commitment to our professional learning network. And of course, we are grateful to our amazing plenaries and presenters who helped make this symposium a success. Finally, we want to thank you for your attendance. And we would like to encourage you to, one, stay connected with BELPAF via our partnerships and future symposiums and academic sessions. So if there's anyone here who wants to present next year, please be in contact with us and we'll make sure we can make it happen. Number two, seek out ways to continue supporting not only Black English language professionals, but also English language teaching organizations at the local and international levels. Three, network with ELT and learners, especially those who have been historically marginalized and or continue to be marginalized due to their spoken language, multifaceted identities, and for just their being. We believe that social justice is a priority and it's incumbent upon us to make a difference both at home, locally, and across the globe. So before you leave today, we kindly ask that you complete a brief anonymous evaluation by using the link provided in the chat. Quenisha has provided that prior to me speaking, so you just probably have to scroll back up to find it. But I want to give everyone warm regards and from the BELPAF leadership and from TESOL International Association. Thank you very much for your attendance today.